On a humid morning, June 4, 1943, at the vast Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, Unteroffizier Hermann Böttcher descended the gangplank of the transport ship. His legs, unsteady after a 14-day Atlantic crossing, mirrored the unsteadiness of his worldview. As the maritime haze began to lift, his eyes beheld a scene that directly contradicted 3 relentless years of Nazi propaganda. Before him, the American war machine operated with a baffling normality. White and black dock workers labored side by side, their movements synchronized with massive cranes that seemed plucked from a speculative future. Women, clad in practical coveralls, commanded these steel behemoths with practiced ease. Just beyond the gates, the civilian world continued unabated. Children hawked newspapers, and the air carried the distant, brassy notes of a Bond rally. No one fled at the sight of the enemy's uniform. In a hushed, disbelieving tone, Böttcher whispered to the comrade behind him, "The Americans are insane." This moment of profound cognitive dissonance would later be meticulously recorded in his 1952 memoir, Behind Barbed Wire, one of the most insightful chronicles of a German prisoner's life in America. The scale of the Norfolk base alone was a declaration of power, a sprawling complex of 4,300 acres where the simultaneous loading and unloading of dozens of vessels made the port of Hamburg seem provincial. But it was the character of this power, not its scale, that truly disoriented the 2,500 veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, the first major contingent of what would swell to 425,000 German POWs in the United States. They had arrived expecting a fortress nation, paranoid and regimented. Instead, they found a society so supremely confident in its own security that it could treat a world war as a manageable interruption to daily life. The coming months would reveal not just the fabled American abundance, but something far more corrosive to the Nazi mindset, a nation that refused to conform to the grim logic of total war, treating its mortal enemies not as subhumans to be brutalized, but as wayward guests to be managed with a baffling, almost negligent courtesy. The first impossibilities: processing and protocol. The systematic dismantling of their ideological conditioning began immediately at the Norfolk processing station. In the German military experience, from the plains of Poland to the deserts of Africa, prisoners were either assets to be exploited or burdens to be minimized. The Geneva Convention was a document to be cited when convenient and ignored when not. Here, however, American officers, speaking in fluent German, recited the Convention's articles not as a formality, but as a binding contract. They inquired about dietary restrictions and medical needs with a bureaucratic earnestness that felt alien. According to International Red Cross records from June 1943, this included Jewish American sergeants distributing Red Cross parcels and matter-of-factly offering kosher meals to any Jewish prisoners, a gesture some German soldiers initially mistook for sophisticated mockery, but which was, in fact, genuine preparation for their religious needs. The medical examinations delivered the next shock to their system. Wounded Wehrmacht soldiers received treatment with penicillin, a miracle drug that was still a rare luxury in German field hospitals. Swiss Red Cross Inspector Guy Métraux noted in his July 1943 report that the medical care provided to German POWs equals or exceeds that given to American military personnel. Perhaps more jarring was the sight of integrated medical units. African-American technicians, operating with professional detachment, drew blood from proud Wehrmacht officers. In the Nazi racial state, such contact was an unspeakable defilement. Here, it was simply standard procedure. The most profound psychological blow came in the mess hall. Instead of being segregated and fed slop, the German prisoners were led into a large dining facility, where American sailors were also eating. The two groups, men who had recently been trying to slaughter each other in the merciless convoy battles of the Atlantic, now shared the same space, the same food lines, and the same high-quality meals. The Americans, for their part, seemed utterly indifferent to their presence, their attention captured instead by a radio broadcast of a baseball game. The casual proximity of killer and target, breaking bread in shared indifference, was a silent sermon on a form of security the Germans could not comprehend. A journey through the impossible landscape. The 3-day train journey inland to their permanent camp, Camp Hermann in Texas, served as a rolling panorama of American might and American nonchalance. They were not transported in sealed, fetid boxcars, but in comfortable passenger coaches with cushioned seats. The trains made no attempt to conceal their human cargo. At major stations like Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, documented in station logs from June 1943, German prisoners watched from their windows as American families on the same platform kissed their sons and husbands goodbye, their tearful farewells mingling with the cheerful strains of a station band. The guards appeared more concerned with logistics than with preventing fraternization. The train windows framed an unending display of industrial power laid bare for any enemy to see. They passed the Glenn L. Martin aircraft plant in Baltimore, its parking lots choked with workers' personal automobiles, and rows of B-26 Marauder bombers sitting in plain view, begging for a Luftwaffe raid that would never come. There was no camouflage, no paranoid security, just industry operating with audacious transparency. By night, the sky of Pennsylvania glowed a constant orange from the blast furnaces of steel mills that never slept. The surrounding towns were not grim company barracks, but sprawling settlements of individual homes, each with its garden, its electric light burning in the window, and a radio antenna sprouting from the roof, a testament to a standard of living that surpassed that of many German officers. At a stop in Harrisburg, Böttcher later wrote in his memoir, the prisoners watched American workers change shifts. These laborers wore leather shoes and wristwatches, carried lunch pails, and drove away in their own cars. One worker, in a gesture that stunned the Germans into silence, casually discarded a half-eaten apple and pulled a fresh one from his lunchbox. The casual waste of food, in a Europe where men fought over crusts of bread, was a more powerful indictment of Nazi economic failure than any propaganda leaflet. Camp Hermann, the barbed wire academy Camp Hermann, their new home on 720 acres of Texas prairie, was the crucible where these disparate shocks would coalesce into a coherent and devastating new reality. The camp itself was a physical repudiation of everything they knew about captivity. The wooden barracks were equipped with electric lights, indoor plumbing with hot running water, and individual beds with mattresses and clean linens. Recreation halls were stocked with ping-pong tables, musical instruments, and libraries. Swiss Inspector Emil Sandström reported in August 1943 that conditions at Camp Hermann surpass not only Geneva Convention requirements, but the living conditions many of these men knew in Germany. The camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil P. Stiles, a man who had studied German in university, addressed them not with threats, but with an unprecedented offer, a significant degree of self-governance. The prisoners would elect their own spokesman, organize their own internal affairs, and manage their daily schedules. To men steeped in rigid hierarchy and command, this seemed like either profound weakness or a diabolical trap. The camp hospital was equipped with technology many German civilian clinics lacked: X-ray machines, modern surgical suites, and ample pharmaceuticals, including penicillin. When prisoner Georg Gärtner, who would later gain fame as the last POW after his escape, developed appendicitis, he received immediate, life-saving surgery from an American Army captain, assisted by German POW medics. Then came the canteen. This was not a dispenser of minimal rations, but a fully stocked store where prisoners could use scrip, earned from voluntary labor, to purchase cigarettes, chocolate, soap, writing materials, and even art supplies. The concept that an enemy prisoner could shop, could exercise choice and acquire comforts, was a blow to the militaristic mind. It redefined them from captives into temporary, albeit restricted, consumers. The labor program, witnessing the American miracle. By late 1943, the American home front was straining under a severe labor shortage, and the POWs were put to work. Under programs documented in the National Archives, prisoners could earn 80 cents a day in canteen scrip. This policy brought them into direct contact with the engine of American prosperity. At the legendary King Ranch, a domain larger than Rhode Island, German prisoners worked alongside Mexican-American vaqueros and black ranch hands. The sheer scale of the operation and its mechanization, using combine harvesters, trucks, and even aircraft for herd surveillance, defied all European agricultural paradigms. The efficiency of these racially mixed crews, where non-Aryans often outperformed them, quietly undermined the foundational myths of Nazi racial theory. In cotton gins and food processing plants across Texas, the prisoners witnessed a productivity born of motivation, not coercion. They saw workers taking regular breaks, listening to radios, and yet achieving output that dwarfed German efforts. At the Stokely Brothers cannery in Cameron, they were tasked with discarding tons of perfectly edible produce for minor cosmetic flaws: tomatoes that were slightly underripe, corn with irregular kernels. For men from a continent gripped by starvation, this systematic waste of abundance was psychologically shattering. A letter from POW Corporal Friedrich Müller, preserved in Red Cross archives, expressed the collective disbelief. The American supervisor apologized to us for the waste, not understanding that he was apologizing for an abundance we couldn't even imagine. Perhaps more unsettling than the material wealth was the social and political freedom. The POWs heard farmers openly criticizing President Roosevelt and telling government inspectors to go to hell over crop quotas. Defiance that would have meant a death sentence in the Third Reich. They saw women driving trucks, managing businesses, and even from a distance at nearby Bryan Army Airfield, serving as pilots in the Women Air Force Service Pilots WASP program, flying military aircraft. The re-education, democracy by osmosis. The American authorities, through the Special Projects Division, were running a sophisticated, if subtle, psychological operation. Declassified records revealed they categorized prisoners into anti-Nazis, 10%, the non-political majority, 75%, and hardcore Nazis, 15%. Each group was managed to maximize ideological conversion. The camp library, initially stocked by donations from the citizens of Herne, grew to hold over 5,000 volumes, including works by German authors like Thomas Mann and Erich Maria Remarque, and Jewish authors like Lion Feuchtwanger, all banned and burned in Nazi Germany. A German soldier could now freely read books that would have meant a trip to a concentration camp at home. Professors from Sam Houston State Teachers College offered correspondence courses, and hundreds of POWs enrolled in subjects from American history to agricultural science. The camp's own newspaper, Der Spiegel, the Mirror, evolved under their watchful eyes from a vehicle for Nazi dogma into a forum for genuine debate and democratic discussion. Exposure to the free American press was a calculated tool. Prisoners had access to newspapers that criticized the war effort, radio comedians who mocked generals, and news of the fiercely contested 1944 presidential election. To men from a totalitarian state, this public discord during a fight for national survival seemed like suicide. Yet the war effort not only continued, it intensified. This demonstration of strength through freedom, rather than through uniformity, was a profound lesson. The ultimate test, humanity at Christmas, the event that perhaps most fundamentally broke the Nazi worldview, was Christmas 1943 in Camp Herne. The entire town of Herne, a community of 2,000 people, many of whom had sons fighting Germans in Italy and the Pacific, mobilized to give the enemy prisoners a celebration. The local newspaper, the Herne Democrat, published lists of donations. Churches provided 4,800 gift packages, school children made cards, the local American Legion Post, veterans of the First World War, donated cigarettes and candy to their former foes. A 30-foot Christmas tree, ablaze with electric lights, a spectacle of energy consumption unthinkable in ration-bound Germany, dominated the compound. The choir from the First Methodist Church, whose director had a son serving in Italy, learned German Christmas carols to perform for the prisoners. The cognitive dissonance of American mothers singing Stille Nacht to the men their sons were fighting broke the composure of many hardened soldiers. The Christmas feast, as recorded in quartermaster records, was a caloric extravaganza. Roast turkey, ham, pies, and ice cream, totaling nearly 5,000 calories per man. At that very moment, their families in Germany were subsisting on perhaps a quarter of that. This was not merely abundance, it was a deliberate, collective act of humanity directed at their enemies. As Hermann Böttcher later wrote, this kindness was not weakness, but the confidence of victors who knew they had already won not just the war, but the peace that would follow. The contradictions of race and the legacy. The POWs also witnessed the complex and painful contradictions of American race relations, which confounded their simplistic Nazi ideology. They were sometimes guarded by African American soldiers from segregated units and were expected to obey their orders, a concept so anathema that some prisoners requested transfers, which were denied. Yet they soon realized that these same black guards could be denied service in the very restaurants where the German prisoners were allowed to eat. The paradox of being treated with more social dignity than the American citizens guarding them was intellectually paralyzing and forced a more nuanced understanding of society. The ultimate testament to the program's success is found in the numbers and the life stories. Of 425,000 prisoners, the escape rate was a minuscule 0.52%, with only a handful of successful long-term escapes. The vast majority participated willingly in the labor program. Post-war surveys showed that an overwhelming majority returned to Germany with favorable views of America and democracy. Men like Hermann Böttcher immigrated to the United States and became citizens. Georg Gärtner, after escaping, chose to live illegally in America for 40 years, building a life and family rather than returning to his homeland. These men, and thousands like them, returned to Europe not as defeated soldiers, but as ambassadors for a way of life they had experienced firsthand. They became mayors, teachers, businessmen, and architects of the new democratic West Germany. They had seen the chaotic, vibrant, and overwhelmingly powerful reality of a free society, and that experience proved more destructive to Nazism than any military defeat. The unusual sights that had so stunned them, the casual freedoms, the inexplicable kindnesses, the productive chaos, did not just win the war. They helped win the peace, transforming enemies into allies and sowing the seeds for the reconstruction of a continent. The unraveling and the return, carrying America back to the rubble. As the war in Europe entered its final convulsive phase in 1944 to 1945, the life of the German POW in America became a strange, parallel existence. While their homeland was being pummeled into rubble from the air and overrun from east and west, the prisoners in Texas and other camps enjoyed a stability and safety that bordered on the surreal. The contrast was not lost on them, and it fueled a profound internal conflict between lingering loyalty and dawning realization. The news of the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, which filtered into the camps through American newspapers and radio, created a stark dividing line. The American authorities, as part of their psychological strategy, ensured the news was widely available. The reaction within the camps was a litmus test for the re-education program. Among the anti-Nazi minority and the increasingly swayable middle, there was a sense of grim validation, a confirmation that the regime they served was morally and strategically bankrupt. For the hardened Nazis, however, it reinforced their fanaticism. seeing the plotters as traitors. Tensions within the compounds sometimes flared, with arguments and occasional fistfights breaking out between the factions, all under the watchful, but often non-intervening, eyes of the American guards. The camp administration, following the strategy outlined in Special Projects Division documents, used these schisms to further empower the anti-Nazi prisoner leaders, giving them more control over internal affairs and isolating the hardliners. The secret war of information and the democratic classroom. The American commitment to transparency became a weapon more powerful than any censorship. The POWs had unfettered access to the vibrant, often chaotic American media ecosystem. They read detailed reports in the New York Times and the Washington Post about the D-Day landings, the Allied breakout in Normandy, and the brutal fighting in the Hurtgen Forest. They listened to Edward R. Murrow's somber, iconic broadcasts from London, describing the resilience of the British people and the relentless air campaign against German cities. They heard American politicians debate the very strategy of the war, with Republicans like Thomas Dewey criticizing Roosevelt's handling of the conflict. This was perhaps the most unsettling sight for the military mind, a nation waging total war without total control of information. In Germany, the news was a carefully curated instrument of state policy. In America, it was a cacophony of competing truths, criticisms, and opinions. The prisoners witnessed firsthand that this apparent disorder did not weaken the war effort. It seemed to strengthen it by fostering a genuine, grassroots commitment. The sight of workers on a factory floor arguing about politics one moment and then setting a production record the next was a living lesson in the resilience of a free society. The educational programs intensified. What began as library books and correspondence courses evolved into formal democracy seminars organized by the Special Projects Division. Using materials prepared by German-born anti-Nazi intellectuals like Thomas Mann in an unofficial capacity, these seminars did not preach. Instead, they facilitated discussions on comparative government, the history of the Weimar Republic's failure, and the philosophical foundations of the U.S. Constitution. Prisoners were encouraged to debate, to question, and to draw their own conclusions. For many, it was the first time they had ever critically examined the political system they had been born into and sworn to defend. The final act, witnessing the collapse and preparing for peace. The spring of 1945 brought the final irrefutable collapse of the Third Reich. In the camps, the news of the Allied advance across the Rhine, the discovery of the concentration camps, and finally, Hitler's death and Germany's unconditional surrender was met with a complex mixture of shock, shame, relief, and profound anxiety. The carefully constructed world of National Socialism, which had provided them with identity and purpose, had not just been defeated, it had been revealed as a monstrous crime. The American response to this moment was, again, unexpected. There was no gloating, no collective punishment. Instead, the focus of the camp authorities shifted almost immediately from containment to preparation. The War Department, in coordination with the future Office of Military Government for Germany, OMGS, initiated an ambitious program to prepare the POWs for their eventual return. Understanding that these men would be among the first to rebuild their shattered nation, the Americans provided them with the tools, both literal and figurative, for the task. Vocational training programs were expanded. Engineers learned about modern construction techniques for clearing rubble and repairing infrastructure. Farmers were taught advanced agricultural methods to combat the looming famine. Future civil administrators studied the principles of local governance in a democracy. The Marshall Plan, though not yet announced, was prefigured in these discussions. State Department officials visited the camps, explaining America's intention to help rebuild Germany, not to pastoralize it as the Morgenthau Plan had once suggested. This forward-looking generosity, offered to a nation that had plunged the world into war, was the final decisive blow to the Nazi ideology of perpetual racial struggle. It demonstrated a confidence in democratic values that sought to build up, not merely to destroy. The long shadow, from POWs to ambassadors. The camps closed with remarkable speed in late 1945 and 1946. The return journey to Germany was for many a journey into a terrifying unknown. They left the ordered, abundant world of Texas for a landscape of utter devastation, cities of rubble, a population clothed in rags, and a pervasive atmosphere of defeat and shame. The contrast was so extreme that many former POWs later described suffering a form of reverse culture shock. But they did not return empty-handed. They carried back knowledge, skills, and a transformed worldview. Post-war surveys conducted by the Allied occupation authorities confirmed the depth of this transformation. A significant majority of returned POWs held favorable views of American democracy and supported cooperation with the West. This was not a fleeting sentiment. Immigration records show that thousands of former POWs, like Hermann Böttcher, eventually returned to the United States as legal immigrants in the 1950s, becoming citizens and contributing to the country that had once been their captor. Their impact on the fledgling Federal Republic of Germany was profound and documented. Former POWs entered politics in droves, with dozens being elected to the Bundestag and hundreds more serving in local government. They brought with them a first-hand understanding of American federalism and civic engagement. They entered the business world, implementing American management and production techniques that contributed to the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. They became teachers, professors, and journalists, instilling in the next generation the democratic ideals they had absorbed in the barbed wire colleges of America. The story of Georg Gärtner, the last POW, is perhaps the most poignant symbol of this transformation. His decision not to flee from America, but to disappear into it, living for 4 decades as Dennis Wiles, marrying, working, and building a life, speaks volumes. He wasn't hiding from a vengeful enemy. He was embracing a society he had come to prefer. When he finally surrendered in 1985, it was not with fear, but with a sense of concluding a long personal chapter. Conclusion: the victory of demonstration. The German POW experience in the United States stands as a unique chapter in the history of warfare. It was a victory achieved not solely on the battlefield, but through the relentless, disarming power of everyday reality. The unusual sights that so confounded Unteroffizier Böttcher and his comrades, the integrated workforces, the wasted fruit, the singing mothers at Christmas, the free press, were, in the end, a more potent force than any weapon. The Americans did not set out to systematically indoctrinate their prisoners with complex propaganda. Instead, they simply allowed them to witness and participate in the mundane functioning of a free, prosperous, and self-confident society. The POWs came expecting a distorted mirror of their own totalitarian state. They found instead a reflection of a future they could barely have imagined. This exposure to a different way of being human, where authority could be questioned, where race did not dictate worth, where enemies could be treated with humanity, accomplished what firebombing and artillery barrages could not. It dismantled an ideology from the inside out. The bonds forged in those Texas camps proved enduring. The town of Hermann maintained correspondence with its former prisoners for decades. Annually, Christmas cards would arrive from Germany, tokens of a gratitude that transcended national enmity. The final quiet victory was not just that Germany was defeated, but that so many of its sons were peacefully, willingly converted into lifelong friends and allies of the democratic ideal. In the end, the most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was not its abundance, but its example.